Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Those of you who are familiar with the ups and downs of Western styles of Islamic studies, and I know several of you are doing courses in Arabic and Islamic studies in the Netherlands, will be aware that the question which we are addressing this evening is the typical kind of question which an examiner will toss at you in the hope that a student will be flustered into giving an overly simplistic or perhaps emotive response. It's a kind of question that bears deconstruction. The deconstruction operates, I think, in at least two different directions. First of all, do we know exactly for sure, definitely, what we mean by the phrase Orthodox Islam? Journalists may use it, Muslim preachers may use it, even occasionally some academics may use it, but are we quite sure that we have a straightforward definition that will allow us to answer this evening's question? The second issue or topic that needs deconstruction, of course, is the second category which is being brought into conversation here, which is the idea of Sufism. It's an enormous, chaotic, vast grab bag of different devotional orientations. It's not a single thing. We can't reify it. There are very few generalizations which could be applied to so protean and diverse aspect of the Islamic heritage. So I might stop at this point and say this is a silly question and put the microphone down and go off to have a cup of tea. But I don't propose to do that because still there is clearly an issue here, and an issue which is of some moment. Definitional issues when relating to major world religions, which are so plurivocal, which have so many different traditions, all of them competing for the label Orthodox, are complex, but at the same time, we do need to be able to offer certain general statements about them. So let's just begin with the concept itself. From an insider's perspective, let's look at the most classical, majoritarian, dyed-in-the-wool, consensual Sunni answer to the question. Well, if you study or studied at Al-Azhar University or at Zaytuna or at the Imam A'zam University in Baghdad or at most traditional Sunni universities, Sharif Hidayatullah in Indonesia, it's a list of the great institutions of Sunni learning. The answer to the question would probably be phrased in terms of the famous couplet in the Jawharat al-Tawheed of Imam al-Laqani, which goes, and it's not great Arabic poetry, but it's just there to help you memorize, وَمَالِكٌ وَسَائِرُ الْأَئِمَّةِ كَذَا أَبُو الْقَاسِمِ هُدَاةُ الْأُمَّةِ فَوَاجِبٌ تَقْلِيدُ قَوْمٍ مِّنْهُمُ كَذَا حَكَى الْقَوْمُ بِلَفْظٍ مِّنْهُمُ فواجب تقليد حبر منهم كذا حكى القوم بلفظ يفهم. This is from a long rhyming creed, the Jawharat al-Tawheed, the Jewel of Monotheism by Imam al-Laqani, written about 350 years ago. Now, what it means is, and Malik and the other Imams, similarly Abu Qasim, they are the guides of the Ummah, the Muslim community. It is obligatory to follow a learned person amongst them, thus have the scholars narrated in an unambiguous way. And then the text goes on to talk about other doctrinal points, but this is considered to be a point of aqidah. For the most classical, consensual, Azhari, pre-modern, majoritarian Sunni Islam and institutions, the madrasa culture, this is supposed to be the correct view. And unpacking it, it's really talking about the four madhabs. Malik and the other Imams, of course, Laqani from Upper Egypt, he's a Maliki, so he likes to mention Imam Malik specifically, but he's committed to the classical Sunni Jama'ah position, which is that the four Imams and the four schools are all equally valid. So to be a Sunni Muslim means to adhere to one of these four schools, respecting the others equally. That's point one of the definition. And then he says, Kada Abul Qasim Hudatul Ummah. Similarly, Abul Qasim, they're the guides of the Ummah. Abul Qasim, he doesn't mean Abul Qasim, Sayyidina Muhammad, Rasulullah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Here he means, and everybody in his world, and certainly the students at Al-Azhar know, he refers to Imam Abul Qasim al-Junayd al-Baghdadi, Sayyid al-Ta'ifa, the master of the way, the founder of what might be called classical, mainstream, medieval, Sunni Tasawwuf or Sufism. So he's saying, for wajibun, it's obligatory to follow a scholarly leader amongst them. Thus has it been laid down by our pious predecessors by the scholars. So the point of view of classical Azhari Sunni consensus is that the answer to this question is no. Belongingness, authenticity, complete refusal of any compromise in your Sunni Jama'i Islam means that you have to follow one of the four Sunni schools because everything else is minoritarian opinions and personal views and chaos. But also you have to follow Abul Qasim, Imam al-Junayd, Sayyid al-Ta'ifa. You have to be in some sense connected to Tasawwuf. And this was, until a generation or two ago, the universal view in Sunni Islam. To be a Sunni, you're a Maliki or a Hanafi or a Hanbali or a Shafi'i, and everything else is really weird. Internally, you have to be Naqshbandi or Qadiri or Shadili or Bayrami or Sohrawardi or Chishti, or there's a really big list, not just four, but who knows how many thousands and thousands and thousands of tariqas. They're said to be four great ones, the Aqtab Arba, the founders of the four most widespread tariqas amongst the ulama, but there's plenty of others. So that's the Azhari definition. To be an authentic, non-compromising, classical Sunni Muslim, to be a card-carrying Sunni, you follow one of the four Sunni madhabs, and you have to follow Tasawwuf in some form. And that's how it was always understood. In the three areas of Muslim concern, doctrine, Sharia, and the inward life, which corresponds roughly to Islam, Iman, Ihsan in the famous hadith of Jibril. The connection was generally accepted by the ulama on the basis of a commentary of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. For your outward life, you followed one of the classical Sunni schools of fiqh. For your doctrinal life, you followed one of the recognized Sunni schools of doctrine, which usually meant the Ash'aris and the Maturidis and the Hanbalis. And for your inward life, you followed one of the accepted traditions of Tasawwuf, Naqshbandi, Qadiri, Bayrami, Sohrawardi, all of those. That's what it was. For 1,000 years, nobody really disagreed with that. For 1,000 years, the accumulation of Muslim scholarship in the libraries proceeded on that assumption. There is no commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari. There's about 75 complete commentaries on Sahih al-Bukhari. Al-Aini, Al-Qastalani, Ibn Hajar are just the well-known ones, but there are others. Every one of those commentaries on Sahih al-Bukhari agrees that's what it is to be a Sunni Muslim. In other words, you follow one of the four Sunni madhabs, you follow one of the accepted Sunni tariqas, you're an Ash'ari, you're a Maturidi, you're a Hanbali. The consensus of the commentary tradition on Bukhari is that. And similarly, Sahih Muslim. Similarly, the great works of tafsir. It's a remarkable, crushing majority or consensus that we find, which is why we call Sunni Islam not just Sunni Islam in our own tradition, but Ahlus Sunnah Wal-Jama'ah, the people of the Sunnah, because our ultimate point of authority is the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. We're not going to accept anybody's interference with that. And also the consensus of the scholars, not just my view of what the Sunnah might be, opening the pages of Sahih al-Bukhari and deciding how to pray, but thousands upon thousands and upon thousands of purified souls and great scholarly minds discussing what the hadith means and telling the ummah what is the most likely interpretation. And that crystallizes out as the four Sunni schools. That's what it is, historically, to be part of the Ahlus Sunnah Wal-Jama'ah. So that verdict seems to be an open and shut case. It's evident. That's what it is to be a Sunni Muslim. And we're assuming here that that's what it is to be an Orthodox Muslim. But we need to, I think, pull back here a little bit, because the word orthodox is not quite 100% part of our vocabulary. We need to be very careful, particularly those of us who are trying to express Islamic knowledge and Islamic perspectives, perhaps for purposes of da'wah, in the rather unfamiliar and sometimes inimical semantic landscape of modern Western Islamic studies. It's a paradigm shift, it's a culture shock that we have to engage with when we go into the modern libraries and read about Sharia and Muslim doctrine and Tasawwuf and those things. It is not a comfort zone for Muslims, and the Orientalist project is certainly not designed to be a comfort zone for Muslims. But this category of orthodox, what are we to make of it? Is there a straightforward translation? Sunni Muslim equals Orthodox Muslim. Well, let's unpack the word. Orthodoxy, certainly a Christian term. In the Jewish context, it is used, but in a very, very different way that probably isn't useful to us either. because orthodoxy in Judaism, as it came to constitute itself as a response to certain reformed tendencies in Judaism from the 18th century onwards in Europe, represents essentially a view of the authoritativeness of Scripture and the ongoing bindingness of Joseph Caro and the basic principles of traditional, classical, hyper-conservative, not to use the current term, institutionalized, spiritualized Judaism. However you characterize it, orthodoxy really doesn't mean belief so much as it means what you do with the halakha or the Jewish law. So that's not necessarily the way in which we Muslims are going to want to use this word. But do we want to use it in the Christian sense? Orthos, doxa, it's Greek, right or middle teaching. Not belief. Doxa doesn't really mean belief, it means teaching. In the Christian context, right belief is determined by a teaching institution, a magisterium, an ecclesia, a church. So the right teaching in the context of Catholicism is that which is delivered from the magisterium of the papal curia in Rome. That's how you know what is Orthodox Christian teaching, the Orthodox belief on the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin. The Orthodox teaching on the Trinity, it's determined centrally by Rome. In the Protestant churches, it's a more complex category, and sometimes they may not use this word very much. In Eastern Christianity, it's used differently as well because it's really not a very centralized type of religious tradition. But in the context of Islam, clearly when we speak of Orthodox Islam, we're certainly not using the word in the conventional Western sense, which refers to a median or an authoritative teaching in the sense that there is a magisterium, an authorized college of cardinals that can discuss and rule on questions of religious moment, because Islam is not hierarchical in that sense. There's no Muslim Vatican. There is no institution that lays down, in some sense, infallibly or implicitly infallibly correct doctrine. So is this a usable term? We Muslims use it a lot, but sometimes I wonder whether it doesn't impose a certain Christianizing bias that then causes all sorts of unnecessary difficulties for us. It's always best if we use the indigenous Islamic terminology, which here is, in the Arabic, Ahlus, Sunnah, Wal-Jama'ah, the people of the prophetic precedent and of the consensus of the community. So, using that definition, let's now consider what we mean by the other element in our equation or in our polemical question. We've already said Orthodox Islam is internally differentiated. If you define it as doctrine, it's the Asharis who have some differences with the Maturidis, who certainly have some differences with the Hanbalis. And even within those schools, the early Asharis are not really the same as the later Asharis, the Mutaqaddimin and the Mutaakhirin. And there's many commentaries on the standard madrasa texts of doctrine where you find Maturidi views mixed up with Ashari views. It's complex. It's not a single creed, not a single kind of package of beliefs, the way that you will find, say, an idealized version of what the Vatican is doing in the context of Catholic Christianity. It's an orthodoxy, a correct teaching, if you like, but because the magisterium, the teaching authority, the cardinals are all of the muftis and the mujtahids everywhere, rather than a specifically delineated body of men in Rome, it's a much more diverse tradition. And this has always been the sign of Islamic authenticity, that it is of the Jama'ah. In other words, it's a conversation, an ongoing, accumulated wisdom based on discussions and arguments and polemic and fraternal remarks discussed in commentaries and amongst Muslims in their meetings for hundreds of years. That's what it is to be part of the Ahlus Sunnah wal-Jama'ah. So this category is not entirely invalid for us, but we have to be aware that we're talking about a tradition whose authenticity has always self-defined in terms of a plurivocal diversity. That's just the nature of the tradition. And we find Imam al-Shatibi in his comments on the istidlal, the way in which truth is deduced from the text of the Quran and the Hadith, noting that the texts themselves are sometimes difficult to understand. And the reason for this, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have expressed himself in ways that might have been easier to interpret, the reason for this is because this ikhtilaf and this ummah of conversation and divergent opinion is something that is to be one of the special features of this ummah. that this diversity, this fraternity in difference, is part of Islamic authenticity. The tradition is not to be monochrome, it is not to be monolithic, it is not to be totalitarian. And if you look at the great Islamic civilizations such as the Ottoman Empire, Mughal India, the Shaybanids in Central Asia, those great moments of Islamic power, strategic power, military power, cultural power, economic power, moments of great pride, civilizational excellence, you will find that in every case that was based on what from a Western perspective might seem strange, which is a plurivocal religious culture. The ulama, the muftis of Istanbul, took a wide range of different perspectives, even though officially committed to the principle of Hanafi ifta and Maturidi kalam. It's always been a sign of the strength of the ummah that this necessary diversity within this large grab bag category of Orthodox Islam has underpinned. Underpinning the moments of greatness in our civilization is the existence of and the fluorescence of a wide range of different perspectives. And wherever there have been moments where a single totalizing totalitarian interpretation has been imposed, such as, for instance, the Muwahhideen in Spain reacting to Christian incursion, a moment of fear and anxiety, the human psychology that wants a simple, single explanation of religion because we feel that religion is a kind of refuge for our identity in threatening and scary times. And this is one of the impulses behind what we understand nowadays as fundamentalism, another alien term that I don't really think we should be using very much without severe caveats, that in times of turbulence and rapid change, people tend to move away from an understanding that the ummah is defined in terms of multiple voices and towards a fearful anxiety about the possibility of an eternal Islamic pluralism. And we see this again and again in our civilization, where people are threatened and feel threatened, they tend to retreat into totalizing and totalitarian univocal images of Islam. And you can see this today in the Islamic world everywhere, and the psychology is evident. Like a hedgehog, when it's threatened, curls up in a ball and gets very prickly. The ummah, when it feels strong and successful, it is expansive and open, and a wide variety of opinions are regarded as being part of the healthy, normal life of the class of ulama. This is a pretty consistent rule throughout our history. So, Orthodox Islam, all right, but it's not like the orthodoxy of very many of, say, the traditional Christian churches. There's no inquisition, apart from anything else. There is no organization that can step on your toes if you step outside the line. There may well be forms of social ostracism. There may well be strong condemnations from other scholars, but generally we find that the Sunni Jama'ah Islam has been self-regulating without much interference from the state, which is always pretty clearly differentiated from the class of ulama with which it often has a difficult relationship. Very unlike the classical arrangement in, say, Byzantine Christianity or most pre-modern Catholic monarchies, where there was a very close symbiosis between the priesthood and the monarchy, with the priesthood crowning the monarch and the monarch presiding over all kinds of ceremonies. In Islamic civilization, that model is quite different, quite alien. So we have the famous standoff between Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal and the Khalifa al-Ma'mun and what he did to Imam Malik. And generally the ulama have been a quite separate kind of magisterium to the court, the diwan, to the rulers. And wherever that boundary has been overstepped and the two try to become a single thing, there you find moments of civilizational collapse. So another recurrent feature in this rather chaotic and diverse religious landscape, 14 centuries, and an enormous geographical sweep, is a recurrent tendency to have a strong separation between, as the Ottomans would put it, the men of the sword and the men of the pen. Arba bi-sayf, arba bi-qalam. And this again enables the scholars to develop and to sustain multiplicity. And the classical works on usul will advert to this. And this is one of the unique features, I think, of Islamic civilization. We don't find it so much in imperial China, for instance, where again the mandarinate, which is essentially the equivalent of a kind of clerisy, a bureaucratized clerisy, very close to the imperial setup. And the examinations for the mandarinate in Ming China and the Tang dynasty were extremely strict, and you had to conform to a certain set of beliefs in fine detail. And so was the case with the clergy and the official royal court culture of most pre-modern, certainly Western European civilizations. In Islamic civilization, quite different, because of this separation that we see again and again between the men of the sword and the men of the pen. There's something intrinsic about Islamic culture recurrently that produces a diverse religious culture that still calls itself Sunni, that still has boundaries which are respected, but which is internally diverse. And this remarkable phenomenon of a predominant religious denomination, 90% of the Ummah, is quite an achievement in the case of a civilization that doesn't have a Vatican to police and impose an orthodoxy. 90% of the Ummah more or less united, but not in a totalitarian way. A single set of aqa'id, a single fiqh, a single whatever, a single way of being spiritual, but a very diverse tradition. And we find Imam al-Ghazali and Fakhruddin al-Razi and other great thinkers, Imam al-Nawawi, explaining that this is the basis for Muslim greatness, and they link it to the fact that the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum, the companions of the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, had a lot of differences in their understanding, particularly of the Sharia, amongst themselves. It's something indigenous and authentic. A sign of authenticity in one's belongingness to the Sunni tradition is the ease with which one acknowledges a legitimate difference of opinion. So if that's the case, again, does the question make much sense? Is it not the case that within this broad circle that Imam al-Shatibi and others have defined of what it is to be a Sunni Jama'ah Muslim, there will be a position which says, I don't actually believe in this thing called Sufism. I'm going to be a Hanafi or whatever, and my Aqidah is what I learned from my teachers in the madrasa. I'm not making any concessions there, but this thing called Sufism, those dervishes on the street corner, those strange things that they do, their ceremonies, personally my conscience isn't at ease with that, but I still consider myself to be a Sunni Muslim. Is that possible? And here we're bracketing out the current chaos and confusion in the Islamic world, but looking at the classical recurrent patterns of Sunni Muslim before Western influence, before liberalizing influences, before fundamentalist influences, before anything, how the Ummah was, say, until the 18th century, what would have been the answer? Is it possible to be a Sunni Muslim and to say no to this thing called Tasawwuf? Well, of course, Laqani would say, no, you have to have the two together. The Azhar would say that. That's the consensual view, but is that actually being true to this principle which we've identified as being part of the metabolism of Sunni Islam, which is to be plurivocal and to allow people to have reservations about certain things? That, it strikes me as being a significant and a real question. Well, this is where we have to deconstruct our second question, our second concept, the concept of Tasawwuf or Sufism. Is it a single thing? Does it actually mean anything if I say, I approve of Sufism or I don't approve of Sufism? What am I referring to? Am I referring to the Sufism of the guy in Lahore who sleeps on saints' tombs and doesn't pray? Or am I referring to the Sufism of Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani? Or am I referring to the Sufism of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim? What am I talking about? Sometimes we're confused by this category. And it helps to remember, one of the things that Orientalists have done is actually to give us this term. We Muslims use the word Sufism as though it's an indigenous category, but it isn't quite. Just as Orthodox Islam is not quite an indigenous category, and putting them together in this problematic, polemical question creates a kind of tension that isn't necessarily there if we look at things from a pre-modern, completely authentic, indigenous Sunni perspective. Sufism is a word that's only about 200 years old. It comes from Tuluk and his first book on Sufism. He called it Sufismus. He was talking about a kind of pantheistic Persian theosophy that he thought he'd found in his rather poorly translated versions of Hafiz and Sa'di. And he invented this word Sufism. The ulama of Islam never did. He turned it into an ism. Islam doesn't really have that suffix. The word that we have, that the ulama of Islam have had, is tasawwafa, and the verbal noun of that is tasawwuf. It's not an ism at all, it's more like a verb. In other words, it's something that you do, not something that you join or can point to. And so, if we as it were, indigenize our discourse again and set aside this Orientalist category, which we tend to use for shorthand, and because everybody's using it, and Anne-Marie Schimmel uses it, and everybody uses it, we say, is Tasawwuf, is Sufism part of Islam or not? If we start to use indigenous language, is it legitimate for me to atasawwuf? Now that's an indigenously Islamic question. هل يجوز لي أن أتصوف؟ هل يجوز لي أن أكون متصوفا؟ Now we're in the Islamic semantic range, and we can start to see what an indigenous, authentic Sharia response to this question might start to look like. Now, so essentially it's a verb, tasawwafa, and despite the existence of a plurality of sometimes rather scatty theories about where the word comes from, it's probable, and most of the ulama accept this, that it is to do with zuhud and taqashuf and libas al-suf. So Abu Sulaiman al-Darani, one of the great imams of the Tabi'een in Syria, used to say that libas al-sufi dhullu nafs. To wear wool is a way of crushing the ego. And to wear wool, well, we know that the Holy Prophet ﷺ sometimes wore mantles and robes that were made of wool. And we know in particular that sometimes he would wear quite rough clothing. So the famous hadith in which the Bedouin comes to him and the Holy Prophet ﷺ is wearing burdun Yamani, a Yemenite cloak, and the Bedouin grabs him roughly, outrageously, so hard that it leaves a scar or a mark on the Holy Prophet's neck. And the Sahaba are angry and want to punish him. And he says, Ya Muhammad, a'tini min mali Allahi alladhi andak. Oh Muhammad, give me some of God's wealth which you have. That's pretty impolite. But the Holy Prophet ﷺ saw the nature of the guy and that he was a Bedouin guy. This is how they talk, and he smiled and he ordered that the man be given something. But the point here really is that even the Holy Prophet ﷺ would wear this kind of garment, and very often we find in his life real zuhud, real asceticism. The fact that he didn't have a door to his house, but just a piece of sackcloth. Imam Samhudi talks about the house of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. It is humbling. No windows, no windows. The ceiling was so low that it was only just above his blessed head, and the door was just a piece of sackcloth. You couldn't knock on the Holy Prophet's door. You had to call out because it was just a piece of cloth. Many people in Medina did have wooden doors. There was wood around, but he lived in this really basic way and sleeping on the ground. And when he died, leaving hardly anything, and at night he would not allow dirhamun wala dinar, no silver or gold coin, to spend the night in his house. He would go out and find somebody to give it to. So that's his tawakkul, that's his reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is a fairly intense form of zuhud, or if you like, asceticism. He was not interested in the dunya, really. He was not interested in becoming rich. Where he was powerful, it wasn't because he wanted to be powerful, but because he wanted to suppress injustice and cruelty and stand up for the mustad'afin, for the weak. It wasn't for his own self. So we find this very, nowadays, in this world of egotistic politicians, and you think of, say, Donald Trump with his hair and his wild emotions and scary stuff, Marine Le Pen, no better. This is an age in which ego propels people to the top, and somehow the electorate don't mind. With prophecy, you find the exact opposite. You find people often are at the top, but not because of ego, but because there is no ego, but just because they want to help. Holy Prophet ﷺ, who is sent rahmatul lil alameen, a mercy to the worlds, is in his position of power and authority as judge and of ruler and military leader of Medina there because he wants justice to prevail, because he wants the weak and the orphan and the widow to be supported. That's the reason for the jihad. That's why he does it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Very difficult for us to imagine. The modern world is just a series of greasy poles, dog eat dog. Everybody has to show off in their CV. Everybody wants to get to the top. The ego is praised and cultivated. A prophetic excellence, a form of excellence where you're not sitting in some mountain cave in sackcloth and ashes bewailing the state of the world, but you're actually in the heart of society, engaging with it and leading it and improving it and reforming it and liberating it. That's a model we hardly have nowadays. not even in ourselves. How often do we ourselves seek promotion, and there's ego in that, invariably. How often do we seek the esteem of others because of the tenderness of our egos? Hard to imagine somebody for whom that means nothing at all, but just wants to help. So what we have in the model of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, his wearing of these woolen mantles, and in his real indifference, a kind of happy indifference to the things of this world. So we're told that when there was food in the Holy Prophet's house, akal, he would eat, and when there was no food, sabar, he would be patient. And it's as if it was equal to him, because he was the one who said, "Kun fi dunya ka'annaka gharibun aw abiru sabil." Be in this world as if you're a stranger or a wayfarer. And the famous hadith in which somebody says, "Ya Rasulullah, O Holy Prophet, why are you sleeping on this rush mat?" And there were marks on his shoulder, having laid down on this very rough thing. And he said, "What have I to do with this world? With relation to this world, I am just like somebody who rests for a while under the shade of a tree and then passes on." Now, this is not some kind of monastic model, because the brilliance of Islam is that it insists that you are in the world for the sake of the next world. And we think that human beings can be inwardly strong enough and cultivated enough to be able to do that. A lot of traditions, in some versions of Christianity, some versions of Buddhism, some versions of many traditions, you can't really do that, to the extent that you're in the world, you're leading armies, you're dealing with an economy, you're married, you get sucked into dunya, into the world, the flesh and the devil, and therefore you look elsewhere. You go to your cave, you go to your monastic cell. That's their tradition, but it's not the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He says, "La rahbaniyata fil Islam," there is to be no monasticism in Islam. We are the people who get to akhirah through dunya rather than trying to get around it. And we don't really believe in attempts to get around it, because the nafs is there however much or however little you have. And desire is there whether or not you have the possibility of satisfying it. So the illusion of the monastic cell is one that we choose not to believe in. But in any case, the point is that what we have with the Holy Prophet, which is, as we've said, the beginning and the end of what it is to be a Sunni Muslim, is to emulate the Sunnah of the Apostle sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is this attitude to dunya that to us makes us uncomfortable when we're anxious about what car we're driving and where we're going on a holiday. It makes us uncomfortable because it's challenging. Not to have a coin in your house at the end of each day, not to have anything. How would we feel? Maxed out on your credit card, and you go to see a counsellor because you're so stressed about it. Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had no problem sleeping because of his trust in his Lord. That's a very challenging human model. To be in the world, but not for the world, and not of the world, but to help the people of the world. That's the essence of what it is to be a Muslim, to be submitted, to accept that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this amazing diversity and brilliance of creation with all of its signs, which, if the heart is open and tender, can be read in order to strengthen our iman. We are here to see all of these things, not to run away from them. Even in difficult situations, there is always a lesson for the believer. Even in the faces of the tyrants, there is always a lesson for the believer. Even in ugliness, the believer benefits in every moment. And if you have the correct disposition of the heart, you'll make more progress by having a career and being an ordinary married human being in the world than you ever would if you were running away and living in a cave and eating a few dates every day. This is the Sunnah, this is the way of the Holy Prophet, this is the way of Islam. And alhamdulillah, it's on the surface an easy way, but of course we know that those inner battles are difficult. So this is really what the ulama have said historically when talking about this thing that the Orientalists and a lot of us nowadays refer to as Sufism. They're saying it's a way of being. Tasawwuf means not really to have your heart attached to the world. As Imam al-Junayd defined it, it's for the heart to be empty of what the hand is empty of. In other words, if you don't have something, the heart isn't attached to it anyway, and you're murtah, you're content. If you're rich, alhamdulillah, you give sadaqah and you're shakir. If you're poor, alhamdulillah, you have sabr and there'll be a reward for that. And ahwal, the states of the believer, are always good. It's all to do with the disposition of the soul. And it's the most elementary sermon topic nowadays, that despite the amazing achievements and fast-moving prosperity of modern Western societies, everybody's having panic attacks and anxiety and depression and on Valium, and this is the phenomenon of Prozac nation. It's the most elementary religious lesson that all of that stuff, all of that competing for more devices and more status and more wealth and all of that doesn't actually yield us what presumably is what all human beings want, which is happiness. No, it's a more elusive thing, and it's more likely to be found in the prophetic wisdom, which is detachment, but to be really concerned with the conditions of others. And this is why he says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I am sent only to perfect the noble qualities of character. You can only really do that if you're in society, if you're with others. Because you can only really know yourself, and others can only really see what you are. And you can only have the opportunity to transcend your own weaknesses if you're recurrently with other people. If you're on your own, you can live with your vices for a long time. But ad-din mu'amala, the religion is a way of engagement. Religion is about engaging with others. It is intersubjective, it is interactive, it is human, it is social. So none of this is controversial or rocket science. We know what Islam says. It is a social and a family-oriented religion which is about service and is about sadaqah. But the key here, if you're going to be in the world but not of the world, we all know in practice that that's not so easy. You get the letter from your boss saying that you've been promoted, or you see that you've just come by a large sum of money. And for the ego, for your sense of your own magnificence, not to be puffed up in that moment, that's quite difficult. That's really difficult. To be at your graduation day, you're getting your BA, for instance, and as well as being grateful to Allah for the opportunity to please your parents and to serve society, you feel really great about yourself. Well, a certain modicum of self-esteem is necessary for our continuation. That's not a problem. We shouldn't see ourselves as being miserable worms, but it's all too easy for the heart to be hardened. And that's really what the ulama are referring to when they say tasawwafa. In other words, outwardly, do it, whatever's halal, be in the midst of society, that's the way of Islam. But inwardly have that detachment and that eye which is always looking for people who might be in need of service. And if you travel with traditional ulama, you'll see a lot of this, and I learned a lot when I was able to travel with my teachers. That wherever they would go, they would kind of not just space out or play with their phones, but they would be looking for human situations where they could intervene in a helpful way. Somebody who might have some misunderstanding that was causing them suffering, and just without reproaching them, just a little droplet of purity into their internal lives at that moment that solves that particular problem. And it's a very beautiful thing. If you see the students of a great, say, commentator on hadith who knows this art, tasawwafa, and I've been with people who administer their wisdom exclusively through the teaching of hadith. This is quite common in our tradition. And the teacher is constantly scanning those who are present and really knows them well. And unlike the modern university setting where if you have issues you go and see a tutor or a counsellor, but it's got nothing to do with a lecturer who's just there to stuff your head with information and to get you through exams. Now, in the Islamic vision, everything is integrated into a single person who is actually there not just to turn you into a more successful wage earner, but to turn you into a better human being. You can imagine universities really having that as the central intention. Hard to imagine nowadays, but this is how it used to be. And that individual scanning all the faces out there, not just for who is not paying attention or who is playing with his phone or who isn't there, but rather who actually needs some help. Looking at the body language, who seems to be distracted, who has attention span problems, who is looking sick, who is not there, and then finding out, and therefore being a spiritual father to the student. That's a very beautiful thing. And such people tend to be loved. They're like second parents. And to have somebody like that is the greatest gift. Somebody who doesn't just give you good revision tips, but somebody who actually solves your problems and cares for you and about you. That's the essence of education. And that's how things used to be. And that is not ilm al-hadith and ilm al-tafsir and ilm al-aqaid, but it's ilm al-tasawwuf. That's how we call it traditionally. the reaching into the soul of the shagird, of the pupil in the madrasa, by the compassionate teacher. That's what we mean by tasawwuf. What we don't mean is what a lot of Orientalists, a lot of Muslims who are following certain Orientalist translations into Arabic in the 19th and 20th century have kind of followed in the 20th. Oh, to believe in Sufism, that doesn't really mean very much. Sufism is not a doctrinal system. Sufism is not a set of practices. Sufism is exclusively defined as the compassionate engagement with another human being in his subjectivity as a way of bringing oneself out of the self and out of egotism. That's all it is. But what it doesn't mean is Sadr al-Din al-Qunawi and the theory of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being. He was into tasawwuf of a certain kind, but that's a particular Gnostic tendency and a particular point of view that has to be subject to the scrutiny of the ulama, like anything else in the ummah, and on which there is a long conversation, and that's part of the diversity and the richness of the tradition. But Imam al-Junayd, rahmatullahi alayhi, defines it quite simply. التصوف خلق فمن زاد عليك في التصوف زاد عليك في الخلق أيضا. Tasawwuf is good character. So whoever improves your character has improved your Sufism. That's what an indigenous definition is. Not an Orientalist definition, not a modern polemical definition, or not the Iranian definition which really problematizes and sometimes persecutes tasawwuf, but the indigenous definition is simply transcending yourself and applying that inner dimension of the Sunnah. So Islam is to be a total package, not just for what you do with your body, which is the fiqh, or what you do with your mind, which is the aqidah, but something deeper still. Your consciousness, your internal subjectivity, your ruh, your nafs, all of that needs to be purified. Anybody who doesn't think that they need sorting out in their internal lives really doesn't have too much self-reflection. That is a necessary discipline. And when the ulama say, فَوَاجِبٌ تَقْلِيدُ حَبْرٍ مِنْهُمْ, they mean it in a shari'i sense as well. Because if you look at the books of Usul al-Fiqh, the books which explain in extraordinary detail sometimes the rules whereby the Sunni legitimately deduces the rulings of the Sharia from the Quran and the Sunnah, and it's really complicated because the text sometimes really complicated and Arabic is really difficult and you have to use all kinds of rigorous methods of deduction rather than just saying what you think it means, that the first thing you have to get a handle on is your own self-awareness. Because ultimately these things are about theory choice. And theory choice is determined by the human subjectivity, which is often subject to emotion. And this is fatal. The Holy Prophet ﷺ says, لا يقضي القاضي وهو غضبان. A judge should not give a verdict when he is angry. We can see why, but that is the case, and it's also the case for fatwa. Nobody, however many qualifications he may have, is allowed to give a fatwa if they're in a kind of state of emotional turbulence. And this, it seems to me, is part of the tragedy of the ummah nowadays, which is that instead of setting aside the lower tendencies of envy and fear and anxiety and rivalry and the stuff that every one of us, including myself, have within ourselves, to identify it through muhasabah and self-knowledge, and putting it in its box and stamping on it and keeping it out of the way of dealing with the Quran and the Sunnah, instead we open the sort of box, the Pandora's box of all of those afarit, all of those demons, and they're the ones that sway us when we reach for particular fatwas and options. That's a catastrophe, and that's really the end of the Ahlus Sunnah Wal-Jama'ah. And that's the tragedy of the Ummah today. People saying, I know that the consensus of the Ummah is X, but I'm really angry, and therefore I'm going to follow Y, because I've seen this clip on YouTube where somebody seems to be saying that you can interpret it that way. That's the end of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, because that's breaking all of the rules. And the reason for that is lam yatasawwaf. That individual has not worn the prophetic robe, the robe of not really being interested in dunya and being in complete control of emotion, not in some kind of stoic philosophical way abolishing emotion, because that would be inhuman, but instead to have it all in due balance and the ego to be disengaged. All of the problems of today's ummah, it seems to me, are the result of ego, nafs, shaitan, hawa. And when that gets into the driving seat in religion and its institutions, then you have a kind of inversion. Instead of religion becoming the symbol of everything that brings hope to humanity and a symbol of that which is 1,000 times better than the sort of mega consumer turmoil that the world is now trapped in, instead of it being a symbol of beauty and openness and something ideal, it becomes simply a mirror to the envy and the anger and the viciousness of the souls of the people who now think that they're in charge of the texts. So if that's the alternative to yatasawwaf, then it is haram. The alternative to purifying the self is to have an impure self, and you can't disengage the self from the process of delivering fatwa and choosing your fatwas, and therefore religion becomes just a mirror of the ugliness of your own inner life, of your own frustrations and disappointments, perhaps even your mental illness. You find interpretations that gratify that deep inner imbalance, and the result is a catastrophe, and religion becoming the inversion of what it should be. Instead of showing to people through the Sunnah, and Islam is the Sunnah, the beauty of the heart of the Chosen One, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the joy with which people entered Islam, instead you show them the raging volcano of your own anxieties and fears and disquiet and envy and viciousness. If you're showing them that and you say that is Islam, then that is the ultimate blasphemy against the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because you're saying my ugliness is the Sunnah, and you're attributing the turbulences and the darkness of your own ego or sub-ego to the best of creation sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that's the worst thing anybody can ever do. To attribute ugliness to the one who is the purest is about the worst decision that anybody can take. And this is the way the shaitan and the nafs and the hawa operate. They want to take the best things, those things that give most light and hope and serenity to humanity and the human heart, and to turn them into things that are scary and ugly, that drive the world away. So instead of da'wah, invitation, you have tanfir, repulsion, which is inevitably what happens when people are not able to yatasawwaf, to control themselves, to understand themselves, to overcome their lower impulses. So in that sense, we would say that classical Islam, as enshrined in the doctrine of Imam Laqani, is correct, is actually correct. Whether or not you define Sufism as a particular type of tasawwuf or not is not really the point. Tasawwuf, as understood by the ulama, all of those commentators on Bukhari, means the process of self-transformation, the process of dhikr, the process of remembering Allah, the process of fikr, the process of reaching out and seeing the humanity and the vulnerability and the needs of others, and not really paying too much attention to your own insecurities, because inwardly, when we really think about ourselves, we see there's not an awful lot there that's really beautiful and interesting. So forget that, look at the other, look at the ghayr. Without that possibility, without that tasawwafa, Islam is simply a megaphone for our own shaitan, for our own hawa. And therefore, not to engage in tasawwuf, it is clear, and this really should be a matter of consensus for Muslims, if we're using this indigenous vocabulary, that tasawwafa is actually an obligation if the alternative is tanfir and the uglification of Allah's religion and the taking of decisions and fatwa choices that are subversive and close the doors of Allah's mercy to human beings who have never needed their Creator more than they do in this age of confusion and precariousness. That's a monstrous sin. So we would probably say, we don't need this thing, Sufism, but we would probably say, using the indigenous vocabulary, we have to have this thing, tasawwuf. And that's why the ulama consistently, really without exception, down the centuries of our civilization have agreed that we do need this thing called tasawwuf. And even some people will say, but Imam Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah says the Sufis do this and that. Read him for yourself. Don't listen to what the brothers in the masjid are telling you. Read him. He has his commentary on the Futuh al-Ghayb of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. He loves Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. Case closed. Who is a Sufi if not Abdul Qadir al-Jilani? Yes, of course, he has issues with certain aspects of the Wahdat al-Wujud school. That's fine. He has issues with them. They're well expressed. But it's not against tasawwuf. Ibn Taymiyyah is not against tasawwuf. Who is? This is one of the remarkable points of unanimity and consistency in our civilization. Despite the many voices and the plurality which we've always said has constituted its most authentic theme. Still, the ulama have agreed, the Ahlus Sunnah Wal-Jama'ah, that this tasawwuf really is necessary in order to operationalize your Islam. Even if you don't use that word for whatever reason, even if you just say self-knowledge and dhikr and riyada and muhasabah and sabr and shukr and husn al-khuluq, use that vocabulary instead, that's fine. But the term that ulama have usually preferred to define the science of those inward processes of transformation is tasawwafa. So we would conclude that Islam can do without Sufism, but Sunni Islam is constituted by having tasawwuf at its heart, and without it, it will have no heart. So I think I've come to an end of the time that's been allocated to me, but I think if the sister would like to share, is it Anna, is that right?
Yes.
Anna, okay, if hand the mic over to your capable hands, and I think there'll be an opportunity for questions at some point. Yeah. Very happy to answer any queries people might have. Bismillah.
My question is regarding this view, this message of tasawwufa. How do we carry this message when the Shaykh is missing, when the Murad al-Hajj, the Shaykh al-Luhafi, is missing in our day-to-day lives, when we are not possible to go every day to the Zawiyah of Sidi Ahmed Tijani in Fes or something? How do we carry this message when, for example, your books are available to us through Amazon, but the Shaykh is not? And how can I live this message of Tasawwuf without the Shaykh, or do we still need to travel to the east to find our Shaykh?
Yeah, this is an age of what scholars would traditionally describe as nawazil, of misfortunes. We are living in a very acute circumstances, not just ourselves as Muslims, but religionists of all kinds. This is an age that increasingly regards us with skepticism and doesn't make space for us or respect our concerns or our orientation. Everybody is under sometimes very considerable social, economic, academic, conceptual, psychological pressure. And that discipline of our disciplines, which is best able to help us cope with those kind of pressures, is often the thing that has been least able to migrate from the east to the west. So we have masjids on every street corner in London, but we may not have very many khanaqahs or tekkes or zawayas. That somehow has not proved as mobile in our age as it did in the past. In the past it was amazingly versatile and travelled and was the reason for the spread of Islam, but now it's gone into, I think it's occluded in a certain way. It's less easy to access. And those forms which are widespread and easily accessible sometimes are very culturally specific, and it's difficult for people who aren't fully members of a particular cultural group to join it. So if you're a Turk in Dortmund, for instance, it's fine to join the local branch of the Naqshbandis. But if you're a Moroccan in Dortmund, you may feel a little bit uncomfortable because they're often heavily enculturated in their own specificities. And often for the second generation of Muslims, those specificities are a little bit alien and difficult as well. However, the basic principle of self-awareness, of awareness of the needs and the vulnerabilities of others, the duty to see the hand of God in nature and in other human beings, the obligation to be reflective about oneself and one's motivations, the basic responsibilities of having a dhikr, of reading Quran, of being a kind of luminous person who walks lightly on the earth, as the Quran says. These are incumbent whether or not we have the convenience of a Sufi lodge or a sheikh down the road. So this is an age in which many of the sheikhs are saying, apply the Quranic verse that says, Kunu Rabbaniyin. Just be people who are connected to the Rabb. It may be, and it's not your fault, that you can't find the guide, the murshid in this time. Or it may be in some way that we can't possibly conceptualize that you're in the prayers of somebody who you don't know. The barzakh and the ghaib are inconceivable arenas in which people do have connections that we may not be familiar with. But that does not, the fact that we are not aware of that does not excuse us from the responsibility of doing what Sufism is really about, which is what Imam al-Ghazali calls mu'amala. And this is why the ulama often say, al-ihya'u shaykhu man la shaykha lah. The ihya is the shaykh of he who has no shaykh. So if you don't have sort of ideal sheikh with the big turban and the flowing beard and the sort of beautiful smile who can work miracles and make you feel good about yourself, didn't have access to that, you have access to the Ihya Ulumuddin of Imam al-Ghazali, which the scholars have identified as a murshid for people who don't have access to a living sheikh. And many people who've worked with the Ihya are aware of its tremendous spiritual power and its capacity. Even though it's written for a completely different world and different age, it can really help with the process of self-transformation. So these are difficult circumstances, but we also need to remember the divine mercy and the divine justice, that even a small step taken against the kind of riptide of modern materialism and negation is an amazing thing. So we should be enormously appreciative of other struggling believers, and we should also recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give a great reward to those who struggle in ways that in earlier generations might have seemed to be paltry. You don't do your tahajjud, you don't read much Quran and so forth. You're still trying to hold on to your prayers and to eat halal and to do those basic things. That is kind of equivalent in terms of the mujahada level of what a great Qadiri murid might have been doing 5 centuries ago when everything was easy for the Muslims. So we shouldn't despair, because the reward and the spiritual progress on the basis of the mujahada, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. Allah says it in Surah Al-Ankabut. Those who struggle for us, we will guide them to our paths. So we must never take our feet off the pedals. We must constantly be striving, and we know what's right and what's wrong. And in every situation, we can determine what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. There's no context in which we can't be looking out for other people to help. There's no context in which it's not right to help parents, for instance, or young people. There's a lot of tasawwuf that we can be doing even if we don't have the sheikh, that makes it a lot easier. And Allah, in His omnipotence and generosity and mercy, is perfectly capable of granting people the highest degrees of wilaya and closeness to Him any way He pleases. And it may be without bay'ah, without having a sheikh. He's capable of connecting us to Him as He pleases. Yeah. And that's true in every age.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum
My
salam.
name is Olaf, and I would like to address that within my own sphere of Muslim fellows. There is sometimes a sentiment that they want to live in a caliphate and they want to be protected by Sharia, this blasphemous society, as they would say. But then I always pops in my mind, like, did you forget the Constitution of Medina that codified equality for all races, religions, humans, or the legal concept of Hurriyat al-Qawl, which is freedom of expression, or Shura, which means that Islamic leaders should consult the public in their affairs. Or maybe even more important, Abu Bakr, that said in his moment of inauguration, oh people, if I'm doing right, support me, but if I'm doing wrong, correct me. I think it doesn't matter if we call this a caliphate or a constitutional state, but we share these values, only they are not implemented properly, since Muslims are not treated justly right now. And the only way to solve this, I think, is through the heart and by love. But what is your view on this? It's not polarization or successionist ideas. What do you think?
Well, Islam is a political religion, and every human being, not just Muslims, aspires to live in a political order where their own values are respected and implemented. That's a universal and legitimate human requirement. At the risk of straying somewhat from the main topic of this evening's lecture, one would simply point out that Khilafah is there by the acclaim of the scholars. If the scholars don't accept somebody as being Khalifa, then that person is not Khalifa. And the scholars will only accept somebody as Khalifa if that person is implementing the Islam of the scholars, which means not some individual full of white-hot rage following the American destruction of Iraq, but somebody who is in control of their emotions, tasawwafa, who recognizes the weakness of the people of this age and reaches for the most compassionate of the available fatwas rather than the most extreme and the most outrageous. That's the sign of the authentic khilafah. That which reaches for the most extreme is automatically discounted as being a legitimate member of Sunni Islam. So every Muslim has to have the aspiration, and it's there in the books of Aqeedah, to live in a just political order, one that implements what God truly wants for the earth. But that has to be on the basis of what the Sharia truly is in this age, which represents something that has to acknowledge people's weaknesses. People find it hard to wear even hijab nowadays. If you're trying to impose the niqab on everybody and beat them if they don't, that's just not the correct fatwa, and the scholars will not acknowledge that. So this is an age of taysir, an age of takhfif. So in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, Imam Birgivi, his book Tariqa Muhammadiyya, and some of our Turkish brothers will know this, it's very popular in Turkey. Birgivi was known as a kind of rigorist scholar. He was associated with the Qadizadeli movement, which was unhappy about public wine consumption and things. He was not a soft touch. But in his Tariqa Muhammadiyya, he says, regarding fatwa choice, وَإِيَّاكَ ثُمَّ إِيَّاكَ وَالْأَخْذُ بِالْأَحْوَطِ فِي الْفَتْوَى فِي هَذَا الزَّمَانِ. He says, beware and beware again of taking the more precautionary fatwa in this time. Why? Because people are so weak. And he quotes the fatwa of Qadi Khan, which is a collection of fatwas from several centuries earlier. That's the normal way of the ulama. In terms of public law, in terms of what you expect of human beings, you have to follow the lightest possible interpretation of the religion. And he was a rigorist in an age in which Islam was flowering. This is the age of Suleiman the Magnificent and the greatness of the Ottoman Khilafah. That's the wisdom of traditional Islam, because it's based on compassion and a sense of reality about where people are. Once you replace that compassion and awareness of how people are with a kind of volcanic hatred and resentment, you've got the phenomenon that I talked about earlier, which is turning the Sunnah into the thing that humanity most hates, that's the devil's work. So that would be my response to that. Of course, we have responsibilities as members of civil society here, and there's da'wah imperatives for operating as sort of constructive, law-abiding members of civil society, and that's the consensus of the ulama in the West, as far as I can see. Yeah, we're in an age of turbulence, precisely because of the absence of this tasawwufa, that people have enthroned their rage where compassion and wisdom and detachment ought to be. And that's the opposite of the Khilafah principle. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala characterizes himself as being Arham ar-Rahimin, the most merciful of the merciful. And those people seem to have abolished that divine quality. It doesn't seem to enter into anything that they do. So that's not Khilafah, that's not being being Allah's Khalifa in his ard, in his earth. That's a kind of alternative, dark principle, very, very subversive. But I just to preclude any other questions, because this is an important question, so I've dealt with it, but I'd be grateful if we could prioritize questions that are directly related to the subject of the lecture, lest we move into a kind of free-for-all.
My question was actually how to learn to love yourself without being attached to the self.
Yep. Well, that's sort of the heart of the problem, isn't it? I mentioned that concern for others and being doubtful about one's own motivations is a virtue that should not drag us down into a state of complete self-hatred and despite. That's not how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wishes his servants to be. There is a certain way in which dignity is important to our psychological constitution and to the proper operating of society. And so we find that the principle of ird is recognized as one of the 5 maqasid or purposes of the Sharia. And ird means something like honor, an old-fashioned word, but it's the essence of what we're looking at here. One has to be legitimately regarded as a person of honor, and insults are a kind of defamation of one's honor, the honor of one's family and neighborhood and religion. These are legitimate concerns. So the Holy Prophet ﷺ says something like, كُلُّ الْمُسْلِمِ عَلَى الْمُسْلِمِ حَرَامٌ دَمُهُ وَمَالُهُ وَعِرْضُهُ. Every aspect of a believer is forbidden for another Muslim to infringe upon: his life and his property and his ird, his honor. So you're not allowed to take somebody's property, you're not allowed to take somebody's life, you're not allowed to take away somebody's honor. So that, in contemporary jargon, means that we have the right, or even the duty, to have a kind of self-respect, but not in terms of my great CV or how wonderful I look when I get up in the morning and check out the mirror. It's not about that. It's about gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at having been given life and the capacity to make choices in the diverse marvels of creation, and it's about shukr. So how one differentiates that legitimate self-esteem, if you like, from an egotistic self-esteem is a very subtle thing. And you have to be extraordinarily careful in assessing yourself and in looking at your attitudes. And this is the virtue that the ulama refer to as muhasabah. Constantly checking out your intention, constantly wondering why you're doing certain things. And ultimately, the point is reached where you're not actually considering yourself very much. And this modern category of identity, which is so important nowadays, what's your identity? My identity is this, tends to become much less important as a source of your happiness than the happiness that comes about when you feel that you're doing your duty to other people. It's Aristotle's definition, after all, of happiness. Happiness consists in good tasks performed well. Not in indulging yourself or feeling great about yourself in some way, but in doing your duty in a decent way. And to the extent that you're doing your duty, which means engagement with others, then you'll find that sense of inner security that a lot of people tend to look for nowadays in terms of self-awareness and self-esteem and self-discovery and going to mindfulness courses and these sort of borderized versions of Eastern spiritualities that are taking the place of what a traditional religious muhasabah, whether Jewish, Christian or Muslim, used to be, and really not particularly effective in many cases. Instead of that, worrying about my identity and my sense of selfhood, build up your happiness and your confidence as a human being by having that inner certainty that you are, at least in a minimal way, doing your duty. The Syrian refugees arrive, do something for them. Somebody is begging on your street corner, try and find out what's wrong with him and do something for him. And you'll find that instead of this sort of concern about identity and selfhood, something else will take its place, which is actually much stronger and much closer to what we would find in the inner life of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who I suspect wasn't constantly thinking about himself, am I this, am I that, but rather, because of his constant giving, became a magnificent person and had a magnificent identity without thinking in those terms. So again, it's about thinking about the other, the alterity, putting the other first, mu'amala, that we heal these inner traumas.
Assalamu alaikum. I had a question about finding the right balance between studying fiqh and digging deeper in the tasawwuf. So not studying so much fiqh that one becomes very hard, but also not studying so much tasawwuf that maybe one forgets some fiqh principles. So how should one find that?
Yeah, it's always difficult to know how to weight one's sort of areas of learning. Quite often you find that the traditional sheikhs will actually teach primarily not through classes on tasawwuf, but classes on fiqh and tafsir and sharia. Most of my teachers, I think, they never really sat down and said, let's talk about tasawwuf today. Instead, it would be a book of tafsir. They'd read an ayah, and then somebody would read the tafsir, and then they'd look at something else, and it would be a free-flowing discussion, and we'd learn something. But the akhlaq and the engagement and the little nuggets of wisdom that were sort of inserted into the conversation by the sheikh at various points made it a class on tasawwuf. So it's not quite either or. Somebody who is teaching you fiqh who is not also improving your inner state is probably not a good person to be taking fiqh from. Tasawwuf is not really a discipline that's sort of in competition with the other disciplines, and you have to kind of schedule it into your diary. It's the thing that gives the other disciplines their vitality and their meaning.
Barakallahu feekum for a very enlightening lecture. Since we've come to the conclusion that Tasawwuf is an essential part of Sunni Jama'ah Islam, would you say that not including Tasawwuf within this notion, this concept of Sunni Jama'ah Islam, leads to the fact that one does not occupy himself with his ego, but occupies himself in fiqh and aqidah with what other people do wrong, the wrong aqidah they have, the wrong fiqh they have. Would you say that this is a manifestation of leaving out Tasawwuf?
Yeah, this tasawwuf as this broad process, this tasawwuf as verb that I've indicated. Yeah, what happens, and the sort of litmus test here is to see with which state of mind people begin when they engage with others. The principle in Tasawwuf, and therefore classical Sunni Islam, is always to begin by giving other people the benefit of the doubt, husn al-zann. If you begin, as some of our brothers nowadays who say that they're against Tasawwuf do, with the principle of su' al-zann, a kind of beginning with the principle of suspiciousness about others, then that's a very negative outcome. It's bad for the soul, it's bad for the unity of the ummah, and it's very widespread. People who are suspicious automatically when they meet another Muslim and want to know what's going on, who does he belong to, who's his sheikh, is this a threat? This is not how the real believer should be. We always begin with giving other people the benefit of the doubt. And to shift from the ego's kind of animalistic sort of law of the jungle suspiciousness of the other life form to this angelic affirmation of what the other person presumably is precisely the task of Tasawwuf. Turn you into somebody who gives other people the benefit of that, not just for believers, but for non-Muslims as well. To look at the non-Muslim and to assume, well, probably it's the fault of the Muslims who get into the headlines that this person is not Muslim. Maybe it's not their fault, maybe it's the fault of the Ummah. To turn it into a form of self-accusation and humility is a sign of spiritual health. But to say, dirty kafir, he's got a dog in his house or whatever, is the sign of the undisciplined, non-Tasawwuf ego that is likely to be very fractious, divisive, and unfortunately we see that all too often. It's the nafs ammara bisu', the lowest self that's always commanding evil and what's ugly in each situation.
Hello, my name is Hans. Thank you for your inspiring lecture. I have one question. You said, okay, without Sufism or the concept of Sufism, Islam does not have a heart. It reminds me on the writings of Rashid Rida 100 years ago. He was very critical about Indonesian way of being a Muslim. Millions of Muslims over there were, kind of spiritual Muslim. How do you clarify that?
I don't know if Rashid Rida ever went to Indonesia, but perhaps he talked to some of the Indonesian students who were in Cairo at the time.
In Al-Manar, he was very critical.
Yeah, I mean, the Indonesian Muslim community, as I understand it, traditionally self-defines in two terms. There's the Santri believers in Java who are Shafi'is and go to the mosque and fairly Orthodox in our terms. And there's also the Abangan, whose main practices might be to do with connection to forest spirits or to ancestral spirits, and who may not go to the mosque too often, but might be called Mustafa and Ali and Hamid. And that historically is the majority of the Indonesian population because of the process of recent Islamization and the immensity and the complexity of the geography. So I myself would say that something that self-identifies as Islamic but is involved in a lot of spirit possession and witchcraft and magic and sort of fear-inducing types of religion and straightforward superstition is probably something I would disapprove of as well. Because one of the gifts monotheism has is to take people away from a world in which people are casting spells on each other and placating scary spirits out there, and brings them into a world where they believe in one divine principle who is benign. And if you look at the history of Christianization in England, for instance, and you look at what the pagan life was actually like for people, in ordinary families before Christianity, despite the church's many sins, still they've been brought out of an image of a world that essentially was shaped by endless contests between dark forces into a world in which ultimately the author of the world was characterized by love and compassion, which is an enormous sea change. And Islam has historically slowly been bringing that gift to places like Indonesia, places in Africa, Asia and elsewhere. So it's quite possible I'd actually agree with Rashid Rida on that point, although maybe not on everything. If you actually engage with a really traditional, despite the modern sort of fashion for paganism, but a real pagan context, if you actually look at the faces of some of the sort of West African masks that are on sale in some of the art shops in Amsterdam for amazing prices, and you think about actually what it does to the soul to regard the unseen world as being populated by things with faces like that, and what it does to children, for instance, it's not spiritually healthy. And where monotheism comes and does away with that and says the world is the work of a beautiful and loving and compassionate God who one day wishes to bring us all into his embrace, and magic is a thing of darkness, there is an enormous moral, metaphysical, intellectual gulf between indigenous paganism and what monotheism can bring.
There is this idea in the Western world that religion does not necessarily make you a better human being. And I read through Sartre's essay, Existentialism is Humanism, and he said that without religion, you can still be a good person, still form your own ethics, universal ethics. And in an age where a lot of Muslims are renouncing their faith and saying that Islam is not making people better human beings, how do we save people from falling into atheism?
Well, they need to look at some of the sort of serious atheists to see the difficulty of generating a consensus about what a completely secular ethics would look like and whether it actually makes sense if you're thinking that what really constitutes our humanity is not that we are in the image of God, but that we are the consequence of a billion years of the blind evolution of organisms based on a principle of completely merciless natural selection. These are two very different bases for constructing a moral system. And usually the people of that type who are fed up with religion or with Islam are fed up with the kind of extreme takfiri Islam that is guilty of atrocities. They're not really talking about mainstream Islam. In some cases, they may never have encountered it. So usually when people become atheists, it's because they've never actually encountered real Islam or real Christianity or real Judaism, but are just in a state of disappointment, depression, anger. They've read the wrong kind of literature. They haven't been exposed to the real theological and poetic and spiritual richness of those traditions. Usually atheism is a choice made as a result of sort of psychological despair and ignorance. Not always, but in many cases it is.
My question is with regard to the kind of different tariqas which emerged historically. And you make regarding Muslim civilization a distinction between the men of sword and men of pen.
Mm-hmm.
But if we look at the emergence of different tariqa within Islamic history, then we see that it was actually the collision or kind of cooperation or kind of getting together of these two categories against which different tariqas actually emerged. Or in certain cases, like in Indian Naqshbandi, Sarhandi case, for example, it was against the kind of secularism which Akbar has developed at that time. So in that sense, that emergence of different tariqa is actually historically it is a kind of opposite movement. It has developed against certain forms of orthodoxy or certain forms of heterodoxy, against which these different tariqas has emerged, and the different schools of thinkings of tariqa has emerged, and how to link that with what you say about the earlier times of emergence.
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, this is a question about how Sufism historically fits into this pattern that I've identified of there being a clear distinction between the people of the sword, the rulers, and the people of the pen, the ulama, and sometimes Sufi orders emerging in response to or in opposition to an undue closeness between the sultan and the ulama in an attempt to re-spiritualize or re-energize the charisma of religion. Sometimes this happens, and one thinks that it should be happening nowadays, and that the young Muslim response to, say, the phenomenon of court scholars in places like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or other places where the government is involved in outrages of various kinds and the scholars are taking their salaries and kind of being quiet and telling everybody to be moderate. The correct classical Sunni response to that would be a Tawbah type movement, a movement to turn away from such entanglements, a movement to repentance and to dhikr. And that was historically the reflex of the Islamic world when confronted by that kind of trahison des clercs. But that's not the option that many young Muslims are taking nowadays. The option they're taking nowadays is not, let's overcome the ego, but the ego is on fire, so let's go and shoot a policeman or something, which is a completely post-classical, non-Sunni reflex. So it is an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a clear answer to that as to why in our circumstances, those who are not happy with the symbiosis of state and mufti are expressing their discontent in terms of a kind of Hanbalism on steroids, a kind of intensified literalism, rather than, as their ancestors would have done, through joining a tariqah, purifying themselves, engaging in inward forms of futuwa, assuming that it's only when society is purified that the sultan and the ulama are going to see sense. That's maybe the most critical question in the modern Islamic world. Why do people reach for that terroristic possibility rather than the possibility that their ancestors of that age group would have reached for? That's a really important question.
I have a question regarding the perennial philosophy and to what extent Sufism is linked to it, in the sense of perennial philosophy having the definition of all religions applying this universal truth to everything. Because Rumi, for instance, had Christian disciples, and you were talking about Islam being multifaceted in the sense of having all these schools, so attracting many people from all sorts of places. So what is your answer to perennial philosophy being linked directly to Sufism?
I think there are a lot of modern intellectuals, and not just in the West, that are made anxious by certain absolutist and exclusivist claims made for Islam or for any other revealed religion that seems to discredit or belittle the aesthetic and spiritual and intellectual accomplishment of other traditions, and try to find in their own Islamic heritage some way of reaching out to affirm the autonomous validity of those non-Muslim forms. However, if we look at Rumi, for instance, who you mentioned, we also find in Aflaki's biography that he took the conversion of dozens of Christian preachers, priests and preachers. He was happy to have disciples. They were studying and they wanted to learn his way. But you only have to read his poetry to realize that it's about the Holy Prophet and the Quran, and it's very explicitly Islamic. So the fact that he took on Christian disciples and allowed them into his circle simply meant that he was a generous and hospitable Muslim scholar. It doesn't mean that implicitly he was validating the Trinity, the hierarchy of priests, the vicarious atonement and specific Christian teachings. There is an attraction, particularly for those who are repelled by modern sort of exclusivism and fundamentalism, in the idea that somehow all religions are pointing towards a single transcendent core. There is a difficulty, however, in that they are naturally mutually exclusive in some of their fundamental truth claims. So many Buddhists would say, Christians say there's a personal God who is love, who created the world. We don't believe that. The Buddhists and the Christians cannot simultaneously be right. The Jews would say the divine nature is ultimately simple, God is one and unique, and there's no internal differentiation in the divine nature. Whereas the Christian will say that is incorrect. The divine nature is characterized by triune deity. In the subcontinent, most people will say after death there is a kind of reincarnation. In the world of monotheism, people will say there isn't reincarnation, there is only judgment, heaven and hell. Those contradictory thoughts cannot simultaneously be true. And if you say they're just relative, then you're in effect denying the religions the right to tell people what is the nature of reality in the name of some undifferentiated ultimate concern or vague, not even theistic reality or truth behind them all, which is not really any religion at all, but a kind of misty deism. So Sufism historically has been very Islamic in its insistence that the Holy Prophet is indeed God's true prophet to the world in this time, and his way is an all-embracing and inclusive and diverse way. And the Quran is at the heart of Rumi and is at the heart of Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi has himself some sometimes harsh words to say about Christian doctrines, like the doctrine of the Trinity. He would have been the last person to say that all the metaphysics of the world religions are simultaneously true. He believed his system was right.
I have a question. You were telling that there was a difference in the first opinion from the Ash'arites and the later ones. What was the main reasons for that, and what particularly the main the Ummah choose, the first one or the last one?
Well, this is a question about what's called the ancient and the modern schools of Ash'arism, the Mutaqaddimin and the Mutaakhirin, the watershed for those of you who know the names, is roughly somewhere between the lives of Imam al-Ghazali and Fakhruddin al-Razi. Essentially, it's about, and you can see if you look at the works of Imam al-Ash'ari and then you look at the works of, say, Imam al-Baydawi, that it becomes much more rigorous, and the use of logic and syllogism and the Islamicized version of Hellenistic metaphysics is much more central to the later form of Ash'arism. So in Baydawi's Anwar Tawali al-Anzar, which is one of his major kalam works, and there was a standard sort of Ash'ari kalam manual in most of the Ottoman madrasas, the first 3/4 of the book is just about metaphysical propadeutics. What is a thing? Is non-existence a thing? What is the nature of time? What is the nature of the human subject? All of these sort of abstract things that go back to Plato and Aristotle, but which are questions that any intelligent person has to have a view on. So it becomes much more philosophical, but it's still Sunni Ash'ari kalam. So it's not so much the content of the doctrines that change, but the manner of exposition. It becomes much more almost mathematical in its precision, as part of its engagement with the Mu'tazila, who had critiqued Sunni doctrine for being rather subjective and weak. And to respond to that and to defeat the Mu'tazila, which the Ash'aris ultimately did do, they had to evolve this much more complex dialectical form of theology that becomes the norm for late Sunni Islam. There are one or two areas in which you could say that the emphasis does shift, not just the form and the manner of istidlal, but the content. So for instance, in the interpretation of some of the apparent anthropomorphisms in the Quran, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arshi istawa, Yadullahi fawqa aydihim. Does it mean God has a hand? God physically settles on the throne? What do these anthropomorphisms mean? The later Ash'aris generally incline towards a slightly more allegorical interpretation than the earlier Ash'aris, who adopt the famous principle, which Imam Baqillani in particular uses, of bila kayf. God has these things, but we don't know how, and it's not helpful to ask about them. A lot of the later Ash'ari thinkers, partly because they're sort of mocked and prompted by some skeptical questioners, try to get into some sort of definition of what exactly it means for Allah to have a hand and to have a face. And they tend to adopt a, not Mu'tazilite, but certainly more strongly allegorizing interpretation than was normal amongst earlier or the ancient Ash'ari school.
How do we interact with movements such as Salafism, which is really growing in the West?
Mm-hmm. Well, Islam is a religion of knowledge and scholarship, and we just have to train up more scholars who know these debates, which are mostly not new debates, and explain patiently and compassionately to young people what is the position of the ulama and why that has been the choice that the ulama has made out of the different alternative interpretations. Otherwise, one is just in a slanging match, and it's my emotions and my sheikh against your emotions and your sheikh, and that never comes to anything. The arbiter always has to be ilm, and people who are deeply immersed in the usul and the Quran and the hadith and can work with the at least more open-minded, vacillating young people through these issues. There's no shortcut. And no kind of sort of state de-radicalization program can ever achieve something like that, because they psychologize everything. So it's about the traumas of living in a ghetto or inadequate social integration. That's why people become extreme Salafis. That's not really an adequate explanation. It's because of insufficient exposure to real ulama. And in our age, and particularly in migrant communities in the West, often people are disconnected from the mainstream tradition of the ulama. Or they go online and they've got no idea as to what's authentic and what isn't. And online you can find any possible interpretation that your heart might desire, really. Websites on Islam and extraterrestrials, to you name it. In that kind of anarchic world where everything is kind of leveled, it's difficult for young people, teenagers, to know what is the authentic voice of the consensus of cumulative wisdom of Sunni Islam. Where is it? Sometimes it's not very well acquainted with the internet world. Sometimes it's the crazier voices that are more tech savvy and tend to preponderate in the discussions. So it's up to mainstream Sunni traditions and communities to pick their brightest, most energetic young people, girls as well as boys, to train them up so that they can engage in these debates, rather than allowing various ultimately non-Muslim agencies to try and arbitrate in questions of Muslim fatwa choice, which is really not their It's not their right to do that, and they don't really have the capacity. They'll only make things worse in most cases. We have to put clear blue water between ourselves and those initiatives, because these are internal Muslim issues and aberrations, and others really don't have the right to tell us what is the correct interpretation of our religion. It's really not their business. But we have to do it ourselves by training up those young people, creating institutions, and showing people that, you know, if all of the commentators on Sahih al-Bukhari say X, and some young kid on a motorbike with divorced parents says no, it's Y, you have to get through to that person to explain that something is not very convincing about his choice. But you need the person who can actually explain that. And also somebody who has compassion and understands the mindset of the youth and is capable of spending a lot of time and expending a lot of emotional energy trying to befriend them and get to know them and to talk them through the issues. And 9 times out of 10 that's quite possible. It's quite possible because Islam is there, it's in the books, it's in the libraries, and what is in the libraries and the madaris is not what is in the minds of the crazy young radicals. We're not inventing something new, we're simply bringing people back to an overwhelming consensus, which should not be a difficult task. But we need people who have the academic skills to achieve that. Islam, religion of ilm. It's a religion of ilm.
I'm currently writing my thesis, and I'm an English literature student. I'm going to look at how it is possible that Maulana Rumi has become the best-selling poet in the US.
Right.
And he's such a highly respected Sufi spiritual leader, and I'm about to look at how his Muslim identity is still kind of withheld in his English translations, and I'm wondering whether readers of his English, the English poetry, the translated works, really know Maulana Rumi the way we Muslims look at his works. Do you have any?
Well, that would be an interesting ethnographic piece of work. I think the way I would take that would be to point out that Rumi's influence is actually not new. People are already familiar with that type of sort of passional, love-based religious discourse, Oriental mysticism, for hundreds of years. So Leonard Lewison recently published a volume of collected essays in which he talks about the very deep influence that Tasawwuf has had on European literature, from Goethe to Coleridge to most of the sort of great romantic poets of the 18th and 19th century, through translations into European languages. And for him, much of the romantic movement in Europe actually comes from the Islamic world. I don't think he's Muslim himself, but this is his conclusion, that the basis of the romantic re-spiritualizing wave in Europe in the 18th and 19th century against the mechanism and the secularism of the Enlightenment actually comes from the influence of Tasawwuf and Islamic literature. So Rumi is just the latest stage in that process. So one way of deconstructing that might be to look at it as part of a long narrative whereby the West selectively appropriates bits of Oriental wisdom but chooses to discard the sort of exoteric religious trappings, assuming that they're non-essential. The rest of it is a kind of ethnographic survey, I guess, determining why people have taken that particular choice and why the translators have often stripped out the Islamic armature of Rumi's worldview in order to make it sort of popular in sort of Californian bookshops. But there's still a certain way in which that is still performing a service, because it still gives people a sense of hope and the existence of God and a sense of love. It may not be explicitly Islamic, but it puts people in that place where they're receptive to religion, and then people can be, from that point, led on to something that's more complete. So it's what Christians would call a preparatio. It's a kind of preparation for the full message. So it's providential and benign, despite the fact that many of the Islamic bits have been edited out. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. اللهم إنا أمسينا منك في نعمة وعافية وستر فأتمم نعمتك علينا وعافيتك وسترك في الدنيا والآخرة. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وأدخلنا الجنة مع الأبرار يا عزيز يا غفار. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. وصلى الله على سيدنا ومولانا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. Thank you very much. Thank you all. May Allah bless you all, inshallah, and give you strength.